Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to this session on trade policy modeling and data issues. My name is Lars. I work for the Commission's Trade Directorate General. And as you have seen, some of you, we also have Angel with us, who is going to be the host for today's session. And he's the one who's going to make sure that you speak during the allotted 20 minutes. And he's going to remind you when there's 2 minutes to go that you don't, well, so you know it's time to wrap up, etc. And following each presentation, we will have a discussion of 10 minutes. You feel free to put your questions into the chat box, which I will monitor. But there's, of course, also the possibility to raise your hand after the presentation, and I will give you the floor. We have, as you heard, perhaps some of you, we have 3 papers in today's presentation, in today's session instead of 4. Unfortunately, Cecilia Belora from CEPI is sick and cannot make it to our session today. But we have 3 interesting papers. We have a paper that starts out with looking into differences in trade flows in MRIOs and looking at what kind of impact this may have for trade policy and what can we do about it. We have a second paper that looks also to differences between different databases. Luca's going to look into differences, and I'll very briefly summarize what you're going to do, differences in value-added indicators comparing TiVA with GTAP. And we have a third presentation by Ilaria, who's going to do an ex post, present the results of an ex post analysis where you evaluate the impact of trade on CO2 emissions along the full value chain, that is not only at the domestic level. So I will stop there, and I think we are ready to go. I did this in a couple of minutes, so over to you, Zornitsa, for the first presentation.
Thank you so much, Lars. I'm going to share screen now. Angel, am I now into the full screen mode? Very good. Great. Thanks a lot. So welcome, everybody. I'm very happy to be here and to present to you our recent research on trade flow discrepancies in multi-region input-output tables framework. This is a joint work with colleagues Pablo and Jose Manuel from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Before I start my presentation, the usual disclaimer, very quick remark that these are our views and do not represent necessarily the views of the European Commission. In today's presentation, I'm going to address several points. First, I'll very briefly talk about the importance of MRIOs in general. And I will also present our research objectives for this work. Then I'm going to share a first set of results on regional export values discrepancies in Figaro, in OECD, ICIO, in WILD, and in GTAP. And then I will also guide you through our results at sectoral levels. We have prepared for this presentation, but also for the paper that is going to be published, an example why this work on comparing discrepancies across MRIOs and trying, if possible, to provide methodological reasons and reconcile differences. It's quite an important issue. Those MRIOs are the basis for many calculators that we use for trade policy making and for communication purposes. And then I'll also go about the methodological reasons we have discovered so far of these discrepancies. And just to mention here, this is work in progress. So any comments you might have in addition to what we have so far identified is very much appreciated. So MRIOs are becoming the workhorse for trade policy analysis, as they provide a balanced and consistent view of production and value-added composition of downstream and upstream industries across sector and borders. They also, in addition to standard IO tables, provide detailed per end user analysis of regional and sector interlinkages. And as we well know, they serve very often as a basis for general equilibrium modeling. In addition to that, MRAOs also allow for the identification of and calculation of various indicators, such as employment embodied in extra-EU exports or in value-added, and the same applies for CO2 emissions, but also many other indicators could be produced on the basis of that. And last point, I would like to mention that those tables are also crucial for the identification of strategic vulnerabilities, as well as regional dependencies. What is, however, we believe less well known is that MRAOs are not equal to each other, and that actually often there are substantial differences in the way the economies that are represented in those frameworks are depicted, and often in respect to key macroeconomic variables, such as GDP, trade, and value added. Our research here focuses on the identification and quantification of such differences in respect to international trade. And we also aim, as I mentioned, to discuss the possible methodological reasons behind that. To this end, we compare 4 MRAOs. Those are Figaro, OECD, ICIO, WIOT, and GTAP. And we go at a detailed regional, partner, and sectoral level. Now, to ensure for full comparability of our 4 MRAOs, we compare data for 2014, which is the latest year for which there is comparable data for all those MRAOs, because WIOT discontinues afterwards. And as we work for DigiTrade and the European Commission, here we have as a focus of our analysis extra-EU trade. Now, on this slide, you see here, I'm sharing with you our first set of results. Just very quickly before I go into it, this slide comprises of 3 panels. The first one is showing you extra-EU exports in billions of euros for all EU member states. The third panel represents our method, which we have used to calculate differences across those MRAOs, which is the weighted average percentage error method. We have also calculated results with the relative percent difference method, just to be able to provide a lower and an upper bound of results. And those will be also available in the paper we are going to publish, but maybe just to tell you now that results do not differ largely depending on the method used for calculating those differences. And the middle panel you see here actually in a way disaggregates the contribution of here at regional level differences to the total difference. And if you look at the top bottom row, you see like these are the trade data that is reflected in those MRAOs. For example, in Figaro, we have in 2014, 2.1 trillion euros extra-EU exports. In OECD, we have 2.2, then 2.5 and 2.4 in GTAP. We already see with kind of a bare eye that there are substantial differences in those multi-region input-output tables in the way they represent extra-EU exports and also total trade. And just to give you an interesting statistics, in addition to that, just for your information, Eurostat reports in 2014 extra-EU trade amounting to 2.54 trillion. So even WIOT that features the highest extra-EU exports here underestimates official EU exports by about 80 billion euros. And now, when you look at the right-hand side, you would see the differences among all those databases at regional level. And we see here that these 8% basically show that the most similar databases, MRIOs databases, are between Figaro and OECD, where divergence amount to 8%, again, at aggregate regional level. And also the same result holds for a comparison between the WIOT and the GTAP database, where we see again that those diverge by only, although even 8%, I think it's quite a lot, but they diverge only by 8%. Now, comparing all those databases to Figaro, we see quite a substantial differences, for example, between Figaro and WIOT of about 20%. In extra-EU exports, and the same applies to Figaro and the GTAP database, also about 20%. Now, looking at this, the middle panel, which is the contribution to the total difference, I think we have already very interesting results because, for example, German extra-EU exports account for the bulk of those differences across MRIOs. For example, between the OECD and GTAP, they explain 30% of the differences, but also between the OECD and WIOT, 26%, and between Figaro and WIOT as well. The only result that it's a little bit less here, it's the difference between Figaro and OECD, where German trade flows explain only 6%. However, if we move to the bottom, we see that Spain, France, and Ireland explain to a large extent, the differences between Figaro and the OECD ICAO tables. And then if we look as a comparison between WIOT and GTAP, we actually see that the so-called Rotterdam effect is pretty important. This is Netherlands, and then we have 80%, 1/5 of the difference between WIOT and GTAP is explained by the Rotterdam effect. And the same, although to a bit of a less extent, applies to Belgium, or what we call here Antwerp effect. And I'll come back to that in a while. So we see quite an important divergences in respect to those countries. Now here I'm showing you very, very interesting result, which is actually disaggregating this aggregate comparison at an aggregate level, at an aggregate regional level, and then going at a two-level disaggregation. So basically the middle panel shows you a disaggregation at member state and exporting sector. And the third panel shows you the highest possible granularity, which means a disaggregation at member state, exporting sector, and partner level. And then when we calculate the differences among those MRIOs by using our methods, again, we have two, but here I report one for the sake of time. We see very interesting results. First, of course, as expected, the higher the resolution, the larger the differences. That did not surprise us. However, the similarities between GTAP and WIOT completely disappeared. And if you look at the third panel here, the bottom row, you see actually that going at the highest possible disaggregation level leads to the highest differences between the GTAP database and WIOT of 63%. So the only result that holds are the similarity between Figaro and the OECD ICAO tables. Now here I'm showing you results of our analysis by partner. So at partner level, here, of course, we have total extra-EU exports going to those countries. We have chosen the database as a benchmark with the lowest disaggregation level because, of course, GTAP sector, we have more than 140 countries and WIOT has much less. So we have selected those that are available in all those MRIOs. And here, not surprisingly to us at least, we see that the biggest differences across MRIOs are explained by the aggregate rest of the world, like 70% of the differences between Figaro and WIOT, but also between OECD and WIOT are explained in respect to the aggregate rest of the world. And this also applies to the differences between WIOT and GTAP. What we also see based on the right-hand side panel, the weighted average percentage error, that by trading partner differences are larger than at simply EU level, EU regional level. And now here I'm sharing results with you also at the sectoral level. I won't go much about them because I know Lars is very strict with time and I'm watching here my clock. But just very briefly, we see also here very interesting results. And what really jumps to the eye is this middle panel that shows that the largest differences are in a couple of sectors such as wholesale and retail trade, repair of motor vehicle, but also land transport and transport via pipelines. And in terms of services sector, we have important divergences in respect to IT, telecommunication, and financial and insurance activities. So now I'm coming to this example that I promised to you because, I mean, alone talking about these differences, I believe it's very important and quantifying them, but really showing how they affect key trade indicators we are engaging in and using quite a bit for communication purposes, gives you really the highest importance of that. So what you see here, we calculated for the year 2014, based on the different MRIOs under consideration here, the number of jobs or employment embodied in extra-EU exports. So, and looking at the top, at the bottom row, you see that based on Figaro, we would have had in 2014 26.5 million jobs. Based on OECD, ICIO, we have 28.5 million jobs. Based on the WIOT, we have 31.5 million jobs. And based on the GTAP database, we have 30.68 million jobs. So we see that the divergence, the difference, let's say, between Figaro and GTAP, and that is very, very, Figaro and WIOT, but also Figaro, GTAP is 4 or 3 million jobs, respectively, which we believe it's a very large discrepancy. Now, I'm coming to our reflection about what can be the explanation for these large discrepancies among those databases. Again, this is work in progress, so we welcome any other additional reasons. So we first had this thought that a very important part of this is the estimation of the geographical distribution of bilateral trade flows. Right, we know that official statistics don't match and trade flow don't match, so they need to be reconciled. These asymmetries need to be reconciled. Then we have a different methodological approaches in terms of outward processing trade, like this is not trade in national accounts, as goods sent abroad are not considered exports. There is only a manufacturing service that is considered to be an export here, and of course this is by the destination country. And then we see different treatment of re-exports, transit trade and triangular trade across those databases. The same applies to the way intermediate and final exports are estimated. Then we find also an important difference between the OECD, ICIO and Figaro, which is in respect to different methods used in assigning direct purchases abroad and the consumption of non-residents, that those methods differed quite a bit between these two MRIOs. Another, so to say, group of reasons, it's linked to the availability of recent and, of course, official supply news tables and basic prices. Depending on the MRIO in questions, like in Figaro, we have a full set of EU tables, that have not been estimated, but that have been officially submitted by national statistical offices, which is not the case, for example, in wild. And we also think that a third very important reason is the use of different balancing methods. And here, I mean, not so much on the method itself, but on the lead variable that is chosen to lead the exercise of balancing. For example, normally Figaro and OECD use the GDP and production as lead variable instead of trade, which is exactly the opposite in the GTAP database. And I am coming now to my slide where I conclude the results which we have obtained. Well, we have seen that trade flows differ markedly in the 4 MRIO tables analyzed for the purpose of this research. At aggregate level, based on data for 2014, WIOT and the GTAP database seem to be the most similar, and they also lead to significantly higher trade flows in the magnitude of 15 to 20% compared to Figaro and the OECD ICIO. However, when we would look at a granular level, when we go at higher disaggregation, the similarities between the GTAP database and WIOT seem to disappear. And we have 2 reasons for this result. The one is, as I mentioned, this prevalence of trade statistics over national accounts in the GTAP database, and the effects that I mentioned, the Rotterdam and Antwerp effects. And then what we also realized that while in the WILD database, there is an overestimation of exports to the rest of the world. We don't think that this Netherlands effect have been properly taken into account. And then the other result that we obtained, that at all resolution levels, the OECD and Figaro are the least different from each other, although even there is different ranges from 8% at an aggregate level to, I believe it was 30–40% at the disaggregate level. So even there are important differences and quite substantial ones between Figaro and the OECD ICIO tables. And another result I briefly talked about is that if we try to explain differences at the sector level, there seem to be the sectors such as trade, transport, IT, finances, and accommodation that seem to be explaining a large part of the divergences. And at the regional level, we see 3–4 countries that basically come out, and those are Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, and France, where at regional level they explain to a large extent the divergences. And the last point I would like to make is that differences in MRIOs do matter also for trade policy, not only for CG modeling, but really also for trade policy making, as we make a great use of indicators that are based on these MRIOs. And as I have showed you in the example about employment embodied in extra-EU exports, those differences amount to millions of jobs that would be, I wouldn't say lost, but they would be less compared to if we would take another MREO as a base for our analysis and for our estimation and calculations of those indicators. And I will stop here. I would just like again to stress that any comments you might have also on the methodological reasons are very, very much welcome and appreciated. And thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Zornitsa, for this very interesting presentation. let's see if we have any questions in the chat. I see one, and I will read it out. Thank you, Zornitsa, from Erwin, for a very informative and great presentation. And Erwin has 4 questions. Start with the first one. Are the extra EU exports comparing margin plus non-margin exports? That's the first question. And maybe you will see them yourself in the chat box, but I will read them out in any case. The second question, can you see them?
Just a second, let me try to open because I have a full mode and that's why I don't see that. Just a second.
If you stop sharing, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I'll stop sharing.
Make your life easier.
Yep, and now. Okay.
And the second question is, to what extent do the sectoral variations arise from ISIC mapping differences across the datasets?
Okay.
Third question, for employment, we are updating wage and employment data for GTAP 11. Did you compare trade by agents and bilateral pairs? That's how I read it. It's an abbreviation.
Maybe on the last one, maybe Erwin can explain a little bit better what exactly that means. On the first one, we have extra EU exports that are comparing margin. Just a second. We have the margin separately. If that explains if that replies to the questions. So we have a margin as a separate component. Then, to what extent do the sectoral variation arise? I'm not sure that our differences are explained because we basically mapped the different sector classification to arrive at one unique sectoral classification. So I don't think that differences are explained in respect to different sectoral classification. I don't think that accounts for the differences we have calculated, at least based on the data I have shown you, because we have we have converged those. And did you compare trade by Can you please maybe take the floor and just ask the last question, because I'm not sure I understand that.
Yeah, so if you compared individual commodity trade by bilateral pairs, you can forget the agent dimension, but so for example, let's say exports of wheat from let's say EU to another country, let's say India. Do you compare that across the data sets? Because if you're I understand that
we don't go at such a granular level. If I understand you correctly, we really, although we call the granular level, we stay at a pretty aggregate level, because we use the sectoral classification. We don't go at HS level, right?
No, yeah, that's fine. I think there are more divergences if you go into that level, for sure.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. No, we don't do that. No.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I give the floor to Angel.
Yes, hi, Zornitsa. Thank you for the presentation. It was very good one. I like the comparison, very complete, exhaustive. The one thing I was wondering, and maybe just for as a way of comment, perhaps having the Eurostat as the comparator to make me easier to look at the discrepancies. I am surprised that we are not so far, but of course it's relative term, right? You may think it's far, but for me, maybe not so much. One thing I would consider is that on the case of employment, like you mentioned, like you recall, the EU tables that we use for GTAP 10 are based on 2010 data for the EU, right? So then, of course, we do the macro adjustments. We use more recent GDP. We also do some estimation on to extract out of an IO table these natural resources, different skills, and land, right? That were not part of the IO table. So that we do a bit different and that affects the labor component, of course. So considering all that, I'm thinking, okay, it doesn't look so bad. And of course, and I'm expecting that if we get a more recent IO table from the EU, the discrepancies might diminish. That would be my hope. And the second thing that I would like to say is more related to what Bill has posted in the chat. At that time, the discrepancies, it was even at the GDP level, right? And so I got involved into that since I'm also working with the macro data. And what happens, and it may happen on the trade as well, given the way statistics work, that we collect the data sets maybe once or twice during a GTAP release cycle, and these data sets get updated, revised, and we may not capture the latest. So considering that, it may also affect the timing. Perhaps Wyatt had picked up at the end. I don't know what their release schedule is. Maybe they update in between. I know for sure. So we were really worried when we found these discrepancies, and we went back and verified. At least we matched with the time of collection, right? 2 years later, World Bank revises. They have, I think, twice a year they revise, and numbers do change, and not just for small economies, but for large economies, the US, China, and those are evident. Maybe this, well, on the trade thing, not maybe. I actually know from the contributor that the numbers that he gathers and processes them do get adjusted, right? So and then again, we have these merchandise trade data from Comtrade, maybe not the same objectives as in the input-output MRIO framework that is constructed, like I guess Wyatt was. So Mark rebalances it for us. Then of course there's also our own processing that may create some extra flows that are not there. But then, like Erwin suggested, we also have this treatment of international margins, and these are like other transport, water transport, airport transport, air transport. Sorry. So yeah, that is there, right? And it's evident that there's some different treatments. So yeah, I mean, but I'm very interested in this, of course. So thank you for the presentation. That's all I have. More comments than questions. Sorry.
Many thanks, Angel. These are very, very valid, very, very interesting points. And just to start with the last one, now that also Erwin asked this question, I mean, it would be probably a good idea to really look at the margins, to add basically to see how exactly we have accounted for margins. Maybe that's another. I know they're separate, but how does this differ? I mean, how does this differ across MRIOs? That's a very good point to add to the richness of the results. Now, coming to your idea, I think that's a very important point you made. The first one because to be honest with you, I'm a trade economist, right? I mean, when I even saw that Wyatt, that we seems to be drastically overestimating extra-EU exports due to re-exports and the Rotterdam effect, that they did not account properly for the re-exports size, right? I still think that, I mean, it cannot be that we are 25% below official trade statistics. I mean, 25% really, really is a lot. That is why I kind of dig out the official trade statistics data and to look in that. Now, it gets even more interesting because, of course, you know much, much better than me. From the official trade statistics, you need to go through back categories. You need to try to separate by uses. And then we have a Eurostat statistics that actually reports trade statistics for national account purposes. That is really super important, because those trade statistics then get further balanced and accounted for asymmetries in the production of the supply news tables, etc. But I wanted to have, and we couldn't make it for today, but for the paper we will, also comparison between trade statistic for national accounts, official trade statistics. Just to see this process, I mean, I think that's very important, just to see how these trade flows basically shrink quite substantially, right? And then, of course, the balancing method is it's another issue, but even that, I think it's a very valid point. Now, on the employment that you mentioned, I mean, indeed, we see differences. The point you made on, of course, the more recent, the IO tables, if you get the 2014, and now with Figaro, we have up to 2018 included, 2019 actually included in Figaro, really a full set of supply and use tables and MRIO for all EU member states. That's another discussion but let's discuss maybe how and if we can maybe supply those to you. I mean, but that's another discussion. Then, of course, employment data would be much more accurate if you would use the most recent tables that are not projected or estimated in any way.
I'm afraid, Zornitsa, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you here, because now we're getting into the transition phase. And the transition phase means that Luca is slowly going to take over. I just want you to highlight the comment by Bill. You want to say something about that one very quickly?
Just the last point.
We need to round off.
Just the last point by Angel, just also to reply to his last point that was also very important. So while discontinued, Angel, while it stopped, but the second release of Wild compared to the previous, differences were drastic. Just to tell you, just to confirm that one should not underestimate the differences between the one release to the next release, and then the correction that retroactively are applied to the first release, because Wild was just a lot of the tables were estimated, and when the real one became available, differences were huge. And I stop here because that was also your last point, right?
Thanks.
That I didn't address.
Thanks, Zornitsa. Many thanks for this. Please, Zornitsa, look at the chat box where you have interesting reference to previous work in the same area posted by Bill. There's a question about where the people may access your paper. And Frank has a question about whether the SNA 2008 impacts the Rotterdam and Antwerp effects. But I'm afraid we cannot go into that right now. I will instead say thank you to you, and I will invite Luca to take the floor. Luca, please go ahead.
Thanks. Try to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So I thank you, the EU Commission, for organizing this session and also for providing the funding for this research that we performed with Ilaria Fusacchia, Roma 3, and with Beatriz Velasquez from the EU Commission as well. Basically, what I'm going to do is to just provide some very cursory and quick reference to this concept and trading value added, global chain. I don't think that this kind of conference and this audience needs to be convinced about their relevance. What I'm going to present is the comparison that we did between two databases, the GTAP in the MRIO version and the OECD TiVA database. And in this case, in a sense, we go even beyond the basic raw data in these databases, but we move to the computation of some of these global value chain indexes. As you know, in this literature, there is a long list, an endless list of possible indicators that have been suggested. And of course, you can find different results. One possibility is that results are not only different because the raw data, the source data are different, but because you compute the indicators in a different way. So basically, at least we control for that. We use the computation within the GTAP VA module that we added to the standard GTAP, and we compute it with the two different databases. So any difference that we find is due to the original data, not to the indicators definition and computation. It's not moving. Okay, so this is a very famous picture. So basically, in gross trade, we have two components: domestic and foreign value added. In a world with global value chain, gross trade flows can be a misleading policy indicator, and the problem is that in order to compute, to disentangle these two components, you need to have very comprehensive and large databases. So basically, you need to have multi-regional input-output tables. And as you already saw in the presentation by Zornitsa, it's not an easy task to compute these tables, and you have many different assumptions that drives the result. One of the most famous databases in this respect is the GTAP database, and here is some reference that is quite well known. What is worth mentioning is that this standard database allows you to compute trading value added and global value chain indicators, but is affected by a very strong assumption. So basically that all the gross trade flows, bilateral trade flows, they have the same exact composition in terms of intermediate and final goods. So there is no differentiation between different providers in terms how many intermediate and final goods they provide the supply for each sector. The improvement that has been done in this respect is represented by the use of these broad economic categories that allows to provide a correspondence between trade flows and intermediate and final use, so that now you can differentiate between bilateral trade flows what is the share of intermediate and final goods. And this is something that has been implemented in the GTAP MRIO version that we're going to use, as well as in the OECD TiVA database. This is the version that we used for this comparison, even if in terms of release and documentation, there is a more most updated version, but as Zornitsa already mentioned, in order to have at least the same year, which is important, we stick to 2014. Something that has already been mentioned, so I can be brief, is that another point of source of heterogeneity that you want to control for, of course, is the sector definition. So in this case, you rely on the ISIC definition, and then you adapt to the most detailed level that is common to the two. And in this case, the common denominator is provided by the TiVA aggregation. What are the indicators that we computed? Here is a list. I highlighted in yellow some of them that are going to be considered in this presentation, but as you can see, there are also some other indicators. The definition, the acronym on the left is the one corresponding to the TiVA documentation. A point that I would like to emphasize is this direct and indirect domestic value-added content. I think that is quite, we think that is quite relevant because basically the intuition is that one sector, the income generated for one sector by the export activity is not only limited to the direct export of the sector, but also comes from the indirect export, that is export taking place through value added embedded in other sectors' exports. And this is quite important because you may think that a change in trade flows, I don't know, in terms of agriculture export can be relevant, but also the agriculture value added embedded in food export can be very, very important. Then we focus on the foreign value added content of our gross exports. This is the backward participation, and this is the index that I'm going to present you with some results in the following slides. In this respect, let us consider that when we export, gross trade flows include foreign value added, which is foreign value added of third countries, but also reflected value added of the country's exporting country itself. So this makes apparent this idea that when you, in a sense, affect your export, you are really hurting your own industry. Finally, there is the domestic value added content of foreign export. So basically, your own value added doesn't stop in the first destination, but it moves along the global value chain. There is the forward participation index that I'm also going to present. This is another important point because basically, in a sense, gross trade flows could either underestimate or overestimate the relevance of your direct trade partner. We are all familiar with what has happened in the recent years, for example, with trade wars between China and the US. There is the obvious statement that the US could be shooting themselves in the feet, but also the idea that when you hurt China, you are not only hurting China, but all the network of countries exporting in the US indirectly, in this case, at the multilateral level through China exports. Some of our results, this is the backward participation for the countries that we considered. We considered all the EU members and a few relevant third countries such as China, Japan, US. And as you can see, in general, the GTAP backward participation index is larger. I'm not using the word overestimation, underestimation, because I don't think that we know what is the right number, but they are definitely different. Of course, you can see that larger countries such as USA or China have lower figures, but this is also a consequence of the fact that the larger you are, the lower is, of course, by definition, the share of foreign trade. And let me mention that in our case, all the data, all the results for EU countries also consider intra-EU trade. These are the results for the forward participation, and also in this case, even if perhaps is less relevant than in the case of backward participation, there are larger numbers coming out from the GTAP database computation. Again, this could be considered, in a sense, a proxy for the location of the country in the value chain, upstream or downstream. But of course, big ratio is also affected by the relevance of the sheer value of exports in the denominator. Where this comes from? Well, basically from the fact that production data in GTAP are larger than in TiVA, and the opposite is true for the value added. This, of course, affects the value-added share in gross output. And in terms of trade, this has already been mentioned, I think, in the previous presentation. Trade flows in GTAP are by and large significantly larger than in TiVA, and this is also the case for intermediate trade goods. The explanation for that has been mentioned by Zornitsa. Of course, the more you go into the details of the sectoral level, this is even more apparent. Let me just provide you a couple of slides highlighting this point. This is the case of, I didn't put the name of the sector on the slide, sorry about that. This is the chemicals and pharmaceuticals. Of course, there is the bisetrix 45 degrees where they should be equal. You can see that in these cases, in terms of backward participation, some of them are above the 45 degrees line, some of them are below. In terms of forward participation, the Gdap database is always larger, and this, of course, it's even more apparent for some countries. This is the case of computer and electronic. And in this case, the larger result for the GTAP database are also quite apparent. Of course, in this case, the numbers, as you can see, are smaller than the average at the country level that we saw in one of the previous slides, because this is one of the downstream sector in terms of position in the global value chain. Now, if you just allow me to spend one moment here, I would say that these differences, we should ask ourselves if they are good or bad, if they are a problem or not. In a sense, you may think that a cynical policymaker could then use one database or another just in terms of what results he likes better. I think that there is some room for work in this area along the lines of what has been done in terms of the baseline definition, comparing assumption and finding some kind of shared knowledge, what is the best procedure. And there are a lot of specific issues, the treatment of re-exports, the computation of trade flows, the transition between basic and producer prices, where I think that some kind of common knowledge and more transparent discussion could be useful. But at the end of the day, I'm not convinced that we should aim for a single number that is the right one. In this case, input-output table are a construction, a conceptual construction, and there could be different assumptions that are perfectly fine, each of them, and you get different results according to the assumption. And there could be some databases that are more relevant or more consistent with one type of analysis and some other for another. So I think that this kind of work in terms of systematic comparison is useful. And it would be even useful perhaps to go one step beyond to provide a quantification of the impact of these different sources of the differences. So in a sense, we provide a list of the usual suspects that can explain these differences in the data, but it would be also interesting to see what is the impact of the different source of heterogeneity, what is the most relevant and what drives the results. If I have still a few minutes, Lars, I would go ahead and perhaps talk about which could be further improvements in this database for global value chain analysis. And I took this reference from this chapter of the Handbook of International Trade by Antras and Shore, and they highlight three potential directions for improvement. Of course, the benchmark in the ideal world would be to measure directly the global value chain at the firm level, but this is something that is difficult to achieve. And I don't follow the order of the presentation. They mention as a possible direction the presence and the treatment of multi-product firm. The third one, which I think we could think of doing something about, is the differentiation in the production structure between firms exporting to different markets. And in this respect, there are some preliminary results in the literature that are quite striking. For example, De Gortari, in an NBR paper in 2019, compared the structure of input provider for different Mexican firms exporting to different export markets. So in the case of the US and Germany, and you can see that the difference is very, very strong. While in our standard database and model, we consider that all the exports have the same production function, so to speak. But even more important, perhaps, is to consider the comparison between firms serving mostly the domestic market and firms serving the foreign markets. Here, there are some results for Belgium by Michel and co-author, another NBR paper, and you can see that the index of participation in the global value chain are very, very different. And this is not surprising for trade economists. We have all the literature starting from Melitz about the difference between exporting and non-exporting firms, and this is actually confirmed by the data. The first point that Antras and Shore mentioned is also something that it's important, basically is the removal of the assumption that all the sector, even when you use the BEC classification, In the present TiVA and GTAP database, all the sector have the same share of inputs from different providers, and this is not true. And in a research project, Horizon 2020, but model, we are trying to do something better. So at least for 2 countries, Italy and France, we were able to access, it's not easy, granular firm level data at the custom level, and then to compute the source, the share of input from different providers according to this data. And you can see that in the violet, you have the BC attribution that would be the same for each sector if you use the GTAP MRAO data. But if you look, these are preliminary results, at the micro-base figures, the distribution of different supplier is quite different. So we are going to compute again now the index of participation, and we think that it's going to make a big difference. I'm perfectly aware that this is not something that you can do for 140 countries, but we do think that for individual countries where this data are available, it would be worth the effort to make this improvement. At the end of the day, one of my teachers once said that models are like sausages. It all depends on the input, as I say in English, garbage in, garbage out. And to make this kind of refinement in the data goes a long way in improving the accuracy and reliability of our results. Of course, this kind of backward information should be coupled with the one about the differentiation then in the use of this input by firms in terms of the destination market choice.
Sorry, Luca.
Yes.
That was my 2-minute warning.
Okay, the warning is not necessary because
we're wrapping up.
Yes, here and look forward to your comments. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Luca. And I then invite everybody to raise their hands if they have a comment or a question, or to put a comment or a question in the chat box, where there already is one comment question for you, Luca. It's from Marta Pachos, who says, very interesting, Luca. Agree that we probably cannot aim for a single number, but based on your explorations, do you have suggestions for specific topics / areas / policy questions where GVC indicators based on GTAP are more advised to be used than TiVA indicators?
This is a tough question. Perhaps I leave it to Ilaria and Beatrice. No, I'm joking.
No problem. I can add something.
You can answer. No, I just, perhaps I remember the presentation that was made in 2013, exactly the paper mentioned by Zi Wang. And they were pointing out that when you say trading value added, you have trade, and in a sense, you could argue that GTAP database is more focused on trade, but you also have the value-added component, which is more from the domestic structure of the economy, which is more the emphasis of the TiVA database, as far as I understood. So it's very difficult, if you're interested in trading value-added, to see what is better, but this is exactly what I meant, that some kind of common discussion in this respect could try to get a better answer, but perhaps Beatrice and Ilaria.
Thanks, Luca. Beatrice, Ilaria, you have something to add on this?
I was going for the vanilla answer, which is if you are working on, but it has nothing to do with the methodology of the indicators, but to the data on the countries included in those databases. Personally, I use GTAP when I have to do to look at supply chains in countries in Africa, for instance, or in Asian countries that are not covered by TiVA, of course, and also while calculating duty drawbacks, for instance, very, very technical, very specific. I use also GTAP, I find my way through those because essentially you have a wider coverage and a much more detailed disaggregation. But that has nothing to do with the methodology, but it's also relevant.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Ilaria. I was just going to give you.
Just very quickly, it is also the case for the agricultural sector. So if you want to do something about the global value chains integration for the agricultural sector, it would be preferable to use GTAP just because it covers this kind of sectors, while TiVA you have just one single aggregate. But the problem that Luca raised about the combination of value added and trade. So in one case, you would prefer TiVA, for example, in the case of value added, but then you have the trade component, which will be maybe much reliable in GTAP. So you have to do choice about what you are going to say. That's this one. Thank you.
Thank you. Erwin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you, Luca, for that very interesting and informative presentation. I like very much the way you're doing it in the BAT model, where you go directly to the very detailed level. So I just thought about it when you said about the divergences that we are having. So probably a first starting point that we need to look at across dataset comparison is the total trade data for each country. In most cases, well, at least for GTAP, we are sourcing it from Comtrade and then further reconciled by Mark Gelhar. So I think at GTAP, we should also do this. We should have a comparison of how far off or how close we are from the reported Comtrade data with the reconciled trade data. Of course, they will not be equal because of the reconciliation. Plus, on the other side, Comtrade data is not balanced globally, right? So that's the other one. The other comment is, I think you hit the right point on the ISIC classification because each MRIO database have different ISIC mapping, right? So when you did that classification wherein you as much as possible made all the sectors consistent based by looking at ISIC classification across IO dataset, makes it closer in terms of comparison. But yeah, those are just comments. But thank you.
Luca, you want to respond or
no, I agree that especially since we are dealing in many cases trading value added, trade comes first. So it's very sensible to look first at trade. I fully agree. I'm more puzzled by the comment by Angel. Update of value added in GDAP. What does it mean?
Yeah, sorry. I was just thinking that, I mean, if you have maybe this is in a country by country basis, but if you have a source of value added that you believe is more accurate than GTAP, you could run a simulation where you increment the value added representation in GTAP to then run the analysis of trading value added, and that perhaps would give you results that are more close to the TiVA by the OECD data, and then again it extrapolates to other countries, right? If you have a country in I don't know, for example, the US was based on the 2002 reference year. If now you are looking at the 2017 data and it looks very different, you may want to adjust that for the US. So you improve GTAP in that sense, and you get the trade aspect that we process in the way that we do. I don't know if that makes. So it's like a pre-simulation before you run your analysis.
Yes, no, the point is that in this project that we are doing, we are very keen to maintain the levels from the database to avoid to raise a problem of consistency and calibration. Because, I mean, I have a great admiration for Mark Geller and this kind of reconciliation that they do in Purdue, but it's not a procedure that I think it's open that anyone can run on its own computer. So I think that this would be an obstacle. Another point that I can see on the chat is the idea to use different, in a sense, raw material for the ICO, which is BASI instead of Contrade. This, in a sense, would be another source of heterogeneity, no? That would explain again the difference in the results. Again, I wouldn't. I think that also in that case there are a lot of assumptions. How do you build this database? What type of data you collect them? It would be good. I think that what the EU Commission, perhaps the OECD and other institutions, they could do is to try to enhance the communication and the transparency of this kind of thing. I think that in other cases, in other databases for agricultural support, there are efforts like that have been going on. And this is definitely an area where more multilateral cooperation, I think, would be welcome.
Thanks, Luca. Yeah, Bachi is balanced, but I guess they also use some kind of routines to balance the data. So there are going to be differences compared to the original national data in any case. I don't think it matters where we go. We're going to end up with some differences in any case. But Frank, you have the last and final question, comment. Over to you.
Thanks, Lars, and thanks, Luca. Well, I totally agree with you, the way you present this. So there's not the one optimal, ideal, true number out there. We should not forget, I mean, that these data themselves are subject to error. So if you compare to Comtrade or to whatever data set, I mean, there are margins of error around them. I also totally agree with what you last said. I think transparency, well taken, that point on transparency. And I think GTAP is actually doing a very good job in that regard. But more fundamentally, I mean, you mentioned it in your talk, Luca, there are two worlds that meet in this ICO. So it's the trade world, the trade statistics, and the national accounts. And there are two different choices of how to reconcile those worlds, right? So the GTAP decides to give priority to the trade side, and that's the domestic economy input-output tables adjust to some extent. In TiVA, as well as in WIOT, they've taken the opposite route. People coming from the national accounts in the first place. So they take the opposite route in the sense that they allow some adjustment to take place in the trade aspects of the ICO. So it's not surprising that you find differences. But what's important, I think, for us all is to think about, you know, what's now reasonable ways to make that reconciliation. Or if you can't agree on some, then at least make them explicit and explain more clearly what we have done and explain why and for what sources, or for what purposes those different data sets are best suited. Just my take. And I earlier made a remark on the SNA revisions. It has an impact on how trade is recorded in the national statistics. Not all countries have implemented them, but the EU has, and a handful of other countries since 2014 or so. That, amongst other things, has resulted in revisions of GDP, for example, also the Netherlands. So this is an aspect, if you do time series, I think one must be aware of. And I rest my case here, Lars. And thanks, Luca, again.
Well, this would be another interesting field to have some kind of time series comparison if these differences grow larger or not over time. There is
okay. I think
another comment on the chat.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to gradually now move over to Ilaria if we're gonna stick to our schedule. We had a question about or the comments about Bachi, and you also can see some comments here from further Luca, from Angel, and from Pablo. But I think we thank you, Luca, here for your presentation. Very interesting. And we welcome Ilaria for the last presentation on this session. Please, Ilaria, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lars. So I share the screen. Okay. Can you see it properly?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So it is nice to present here this ongoing work with Alessandro Antimiani. I shift now the focus to very coherent presentation. Now we are going to look still at global value chains, but looking at emission. And specifically, we are going to look at the environmental impact along global supply chains of trade policy. So this is an ongoing work, so every comment or suggestions are very welcome. So the presentation is divided in 4 main parts. I will give you a background and describe the modeling exercise that we have done. And then Alessandro will explore our preliminary results, and he will draw some conclusion. First of all, the relationship between trade policy and the environmental outcome is a quite contentious one. And this is because essentially the linkages between trade and climate are quite complex. They occur in several directions, and there are both direct and indirect mechanisms which are in place. There is a bidirectional interaction between trade and climate change. From one side, trade affects climate change through direct and indirect channels. For example, a direct one is through scale and composition effect happening just because production and international transportation increase because of an increase, for example, in trade. But trade also affects crucially where the production effectively takes place. And if we consider that the carbon intensity of production is different among the different countries, this implies that there is an effect on the level of emission, both at the country level and at the global level. The literature also outlines that the role of trade in diffusing green technology or in helping countries transition to a low carbon economy. On the other hand, climate change has an impact on trade, and this is because there are physical effects arising, for example, from climate damages, which impact directly the productivity of for some sectors or country. And there are also policy effects arising from the environmental policy implemented on trade. Moreover, the global characteristic of climate-related impacts and also responsibilities increase with such complexity within the political debate. There is a quite recent and highly debated paper by Shapiro, which essentially find a negative relation between trade policy and CO2 emission intensity. His main finding is that the import tariff and non-tariff barriers are lower on dirty than on clean industries. Our work is somehow linked to that to this finding, because we are going to assess the environmental outcome of trade policy. And specifically, we try to provide some answer to the question of could trade agreements help to meet climate goals? In order to shed some light on this, we propose a comprehensive modeling approach for policy impact evaluation, which essentially includes the composition of emission along the global value chains. As a case study, we use the free trade agreements between the European Union and Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. And this is because these are FTAs enough old to have already developed FTA-related trade flows, meaning that this allows us to compare to different situations with or without trade agreements. So more specifically on the modeling, So we introduced the CO2 supply chain decomposition into the GTAP ERD model in order to take trace of the emissions linked to intermediate trade as well as to final consumption. Our aim is to consider both the direct and indirect CO2 emissions, which are generated both directly from the production of a given product or services, but and also indirect those emissions which are indirectly generated by the production and transportation of all the inputs which are required in order to produce a final good or service. In order to do so, to include both this kind of effects in terms of emission, we developed a model integrated environmental extended inter-country input-output system, where essentially we consider and use the linkages across industries and countries in order to quantify the gross output in each stage of production, which is required in order to produce 1 unit of final good or service. Through this quantification, we can compute the CO2 equivalent emissions global multiplier, which are then used in order to reallocate emission to each productive link in the global trade system. So what we essentially we can compute is within the GTAP ERD model, the emission embedded in trade, meaning that we can distinguish the sector or sector country pair of origin, export, and import in terms of course, emissions in each of the shipments. And also we provide some statistics about the emissions which are embedded in final goods, meaning that we can reallocate emission to each production link up to the final consumption, which can give us an idea of the, for example, of the footprint of consumption. In terms of data, we use the GTAP E version of the GTAP database, meaning that we take into consideration the CO2 emissions, but distinguished by fuel and by user, but we do not take into account non-CO2 emissions. The reference here is, of course, 2014. And we simulated two different paths. The business as usual, which is defined as the essentially the status quo, where the free trade agreement is already implemented. And then we define another scenario, which we call the MFN, which is the situation where negotiation indeed failed, and so bilateral MFN tariffs are applied. So I give the floor to Alessandro, which discuss our results.
Thanks, Ilaria. So as Ilaria already said, the idea is to give some more, to deep the information on the impact of an FTA, so a trade policy, in terms of CO2 emissions, because there is now a lot of discussion about the idea that more trade brings automatically more CO2 emissions, and generally speaking, from the Shapiro breaking discussion, the idea that there is a bias in the trade policy towards the dirty sectors. So we first checked, generally speaking, that there is a correlation between the tariff schedule and the change in the CO2 emissions. You see, even if it's very simple correlation, it's quite not high, but there is some kind of correlation. However, if we go ahead exactly with the next slide, what we want to show with the tool that we use is that clearly, if we take same situation, because this FTAs has been done with 3 different countries, but more or less at the same time between 2013 and 2015, the picture can be completely different. First of all, this kind of correlation it's when we look at the change in the CO2 emissions, so the column in the middle, the green one, which is both domestic and foreign. So clearly, when we say that there is a link between trade policy and the change in the CO2 emissions, we have to take into account that the foreign component, so the inputs that are used to increase trade, then as a consequence, the increase in CO2 emissions clearly contains also the foreign. And clearly, it's quite complicated to link a bilateral trade policy, in this case, like between the EU and the Ecuador, and the foreign trade. So that is the first point. But looking at the results, in this case, we observe that the change in the CO2 emissions is more or less along more sectors than the sector that are the most important as a share in the CO2 emissions. So the third column, no? So the share of sector on total CO2. So clearly we have an increase in primary agri-food, which are also the one that are contributing more in the total emissions linked to export. In this case, we are talking about export from Ecuador to the EU. But we can see that the change is also in many other sectors like fishing, textile, metals.
Just a point of clarification. Can you walk us through where you mentioned the primary sector? So the first blue column, share on emissions in FTA base 9.1, and then if you move right, can you just briefly explain what each of the columns here mean, because I couldn't really follow.
Okay, so this is just the share in emissions. So how much the sector counts on emissions in export, in FTA. And then is clearly the third column is how this share change. So the increase is just in percentage change. So clearly the absolute value can create a different picture, but it will be too many slides. So we just focus on the percentage change just to give the feel. In this case is only the column in the middle, the change in CO2 emissions independently of the total. No? So this is just, so it's just to tell you that clearly the first and third column could be linked. In this case is primary and agri-food, and also in the land transport. But we can also see that the FTA contributes to by somehow to increase the importance of other sectors in the contribution of CO2 emissions. I don't know if this is good or not good. What I'm saying is that the picture can be affected by the FTAs, and the direction is not, as I said before, is not absolutely linked to the most dirty sectors are the one increasing more, is the middle column. And second, when you look at the composition, domestic and foreign, we can see that an FTA, in this case, the foreign content of CO2 emission in export is increasing more than the domestic. It means that a bilateral tariff scheme is more linked to domestic CO2 emissions content, because otherwise we should assume that the bias, it includes also all the backward inputs to produce a certain sector and certain production. So here we can see, so the most important for us is the column in the center that is showing that there is more increase in foreign emission than domestic. Is not absolutely, it's not always given that the most dirty sector are the one increasing more. There is also, a change in the picture among other sectors. And then clearly we have also the share of the EU on the foreign emissions. So in this case, for example, we could say that the FTA is producing an increase in the CO2 emission because of the FTA. And so in that case, we could say that there is some kind of link in the tariff schedule of the EU and the impact on the CO2 emission. But then if we go in the next slide, we see that this is not more the case, because if we see the very last row, in this case, the share of EU on foreign emission is decreasing. So in this case, is a different opposite results than in Ecuador. But at the same time, we observe more or less the same picture of before, but here the link probably it's more important, because we see that primary agri-food and chemicals, and then land transport, that are the one as a share, apart from minerals. And then we have also iron and steel, that are also increasing as a change in CO2 emission and share of sector on total CO2 emission at the very end. So in this case, there is more concentration in terms of impact. And again, I want to stress the idea that foreign emissions are in any case increasing more than domestic ones. And then the last slide, Colombia. In Colombia, the picture, it's giving another insight. So foreign emission, again, is increasing more than domestic. Here we are in the situation of the first case, which was Ecuador, I guess, where there is a sort of diversification of the increase in the change in CO2 emission at sectoral level, the column in the sand. But then in this case, land transport, which always plays a big role in the sharing emission in the FTA, in the baseline, here is not increasing so much. So in the case of Colombia, we observe that, for example, there is not a significant increase in the land transport, while for Peru and Ecuador, it has been always quite important and is a part of our in our conclusion. Here, what is also interesting is the role of trade services. So instead of having an increase in land transport, in this case, Colombia is increasing, even it's clearly small in terms of absolute terms, but that is more like in trade and service. So here there is a sort more in servicification of, the FTA is improving the servicification of the Colombia economy, and in terms of emission, is less intensity than land transport. And then if we go to sort of some conclusion, as we say, we have only one case, Ecuador, that we can observe a strong link between tariff schedule, in this case the EU tariff schedule, the CO2 emissions pooled by the FTAs, as we remember, because it was increasing also the role of the EU. Land transport is always significant. That is quite interesting, because we always observe that FTA is increasing CO2 emission overall because of this intensity, the dimension of if the economy grows, then we have a CO2 emission. But then clearly we can see that land transport is always significant, and land transport is among the other transport, the one that environmental improvement can play a big role, because clearly there is a lot of expectation that land transport could be more and more electrified. And then finally, the point I stress in all the three cases, that the foreign value added increase more than domestic. And then again, so it's hard to link bilateral, a direct bilateral link between tariff and indirect trade. And then it's also quite interesting that for Peru, for example, the EU is also reducing its role as foreign value-added supply. So for us, at first, as we said, it's an ongoing project. As first result, there is no clear evidence for the Shapiro conclusion, even if Shapiro was looking more downstream, upstream. But that's just to give you the idea that we don't see this clear evidence. And then this land transport, and specifically in the case of Colombia, where we have trade in services, so services for trade, is also quite interesting. That means that the impact of FTA can be different as a general common sense, and then in some cases could be, I don't want to say positive because we don't want to derive positive or negative conclusion, generally speaking, but clearly there is also different results, as I already show in 2 cases on top of 3, that there was a sort of diversification of the contribution of sectors to the CO2 emissions, which means that again, it's not positive or negative, but clearly it's is a field that needs to be more deepened, more that we should analyze a little bit more further, and probably we are going to, we can detail more the results using the tool, and then we can look also to the backward linkages and see what is going on. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Alessandro, for that. And with this, we then open up the floor for questions. And I see that Luca has raised his hand. So you have the floor, Luca.
Thanks. I just first of all need to have a clarification about the results, because it's still unclear to me what is the baseline and what is the simulation in terms of reading the results.
Yeah, that is, we use the model. In this case, was clearly the objective of the analysis was not to make a trade analysis. So we were quite straight. So one word is a word which is the current one. So we know that the FTAs with Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia has been ratified. So they mainly are zero tariffs since 2013 and 2015. But then there could be a sort of counterfactual war where instead of the FTAs, they wouldn't have been ratified. It means that all these countries would have failed in the MFN situation.
So in some cases, you see an increase in emission as a consequence of going back.
No. This was all the bars you can see, they were FTAs against MFN. So the increase was comparing MFN situation against FTAs. And
so
clearly
FTA, more emissions in general.
Yeah, more emission, because this is
more emission for each and every sector. There is no negative sign.
No negative sign. But this is quite normal, because there is the sites impact. This is driven by the GDP growth. So in any case, there could be some impact that is 0.00. But we didn't observe any negative. In any case, we took out some sectors from the list, which are mainly some of the energy one, but we should be positive in any case. But we didn't observe any negative impact as far as I know. I don't know if Ilaria remembers some negative result, but no.
If I can make a comment after the questions, I think that these results are interesting, but in general, if we want to draw some conclusion about the environmental impact, we should keep something constant, ceteris paribus, which is, production level, welfare, whatever, because otherwise, in a sense, it's always true that when there is more economic activity implied by liberalization, you pollute more in some sense. So the question is not only that you emit more, is that, okay, if we want to achieve this target of production, of welfare, consumption, whatever, if we don't use international trade as an instrument, as a tool, what is the alternative? Is it better? But you know what I mean? This would be the strict environmental implication. Otherwise, the result is interesting, but we are comparing two different levels of activity of the system. Thanks.
Yeah, but to a quick reply, in this case, the context is strictly a trade policy context. So and then there is a debate about not this. So now the debate is that these FTAs cause environmental cost. And then the point is clearly that some of the FTAs have been already in place and some other can be developed, can be signed, whatever. So yeah, the objective was to look, strictly speaking, at what is the trade policy consequence in terms of CO2 emissions. And we know that clearly there is a positive impact because a positive impact on the economy usually brings a positive income on the emission. But then we were looking at the composition and at the role of the two players, so specifically of the EU, and then also starting from the idea to understand if there is any link from the initial level, the MFN level, in this case of the EU, and then the impacts to emissions. So it was a little bit a different target of analysis. I agree with you, but the objective was a little bit more trade policy institutional objective.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you, Luca. And I give the floor to Angel.
Yes, thank you, Alessandro. Yeah, I think I was also struggling a little bit with the columns and the lot of information there. But yeah, no, and also I guess it's looking at the EU policy, the Green Deal, and this, expecting more from partners, right, to get a global consensus and reducing emissions. So maybe that's the FTA is what you, like you said, you would expect that to happen if nothing is getting done. And now that you have that, that may be your new base, or like, do you want to revert to the base the level of emissions before going to 2030 or something, like more like Luca said, that's you keeping you constant, or if that's externally imposed by the international agreements, what maybe let the model tell you what tax for lack of a better instrument, what tax on tariffs will make you get to that goal, right? Or you can even start playing around with different simulations and say, I just want to make sure that the simulation tells me how revert all these emissions, right? I mean, endogenously, maybe completely crazy on the political economy, but kind of just to know the cost of the emissions result by the FTA if nothing is done, which is what you have, right? If you just, and you believe the model, that is what the emissions accounting will do of these CO2s. That's kind of like, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting topic to continue to explore and to add on. I think you guys have a lot there to exploit. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I mean, that's, as I said, it's a preliminary work, but the most interesting for us, and also for the institution as the European Commission, is to look also, for now, is more to look into the details. It's quite interesting to observe. Then clearly the picture can change, but I don't think it can change dramatically because many reasons in the input-out tables. And so, we know that most of the share will be the same. So in any case, I don't think that the decomposition picture will change dramatically. Some results like, if we were in a world with MFN and then with FTA in place, it's true what you said, that there is a bias when we do this, but it's also when we observe that the role of the EU as foreign value added decrease, okay, probably could be not negative, could be zero, but that's make the policy debate can give a different view, because now people always the civil society, the claim is with FTAs, you are increasing the CO2 emissions, but also because you are participating more in the domestic activities of the partner, no? So it's not just because you are increasing the cross trade, but also because you are entering, and that is not the case. Or there is always the debate of the more you increase trade, the more you increase transport, the more you increase CO2 emission. But then in the case of Colombia, we can observe that this is apparently Colombia has a comparative advantages in trading on services and so on, which are not so polluting. And then it means that you are contributing to the economy of Colombia, to the growth of Colombia, but focusing on some sectors that are not environmental dirty, if you want to say like this. So to show as a first look that the impact is not, I mean, that there is not an equation FTA, trade liberalization equal CO2 emissions increase, or at least environmental bad news, no? There are, if you look at the composition, and then it means the next step, like this land transport, or not only, there is also now the discussion on forest. Clearly, the trade policy, at least the EU trade policy and the EU trade agreement, they contain also specific approach. So this is also to help to build, to design new area of FTAs, where clearly if you observe that land transport, as we observe, is always important in terms of impact, then clearly specific FTAs can include specific tool, funds, specific project to support, to prevent this approach, which is exactly what has been done with the Mercosur in terms to prevent deforestation. No? So if you know where is the problem, you can act in the design of the trade policies. That is the final target, no? Is to improve our knowledge, to improve our design of trade policy.
All right. Thanks, Alessandro. Ilaria, do you have anything to add as final comments?
No, just that we were aware about the scale effect arising from trade liberalization, but as Alessandro said, the focus was essentially on the composition of sector, more intensive or less intensive in terms of emission. And also, which is an area that we should develop further, is the leakage. So, which are the countries also which are more or less affected in terms of the bilateral agreements. So, we just we do not have touch any technological progress or anything of this kind. We have not touched at all the CO2 emission intensity, just because we want, the aim was to understand the role only of trade policy, that in one link.
Yeah, I want just to add, because
Shortly, we have to break.
Yeah, no, very short, because it will be something that I shouldn't say, but looking at these results, clearly, if you think at the carbon border adjust mechanism, in two cases, you have that the EU is increasing its role in the foreign value added. So mainly it's the EU part of the carbon leakage. In one case, it's not. So clearly, in one case, the carbon border adjust mechanism can play a role because there is other country contributing to this. So clearly, also when you look at the other policies, the different role that the partner can play, then there is the third countries, and then there is the carbon leakage issue. And according to the results, the three countries, two of them show different results compared to the third one. And then clearly, where you want to act, it can change.
All right, I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much, Ilaria, Alessandro. Thank you also to Zornitsa and Luca for making this a very interesting session. And thanks to everybody who has been listening in and for the comments in the chat box. It's amazing that we can have so many people getting interested in balanced or unbalanced trade statistics. You need to be among special people for that, and I appreciate this company. And I just want to thank you all again, and I wish you a very pleasant and good rest of this conference. So thank you very much, and take care, and I'll see you around in one of the other sessions. Thanks. Bye-bye.